Welcome students to the EPG Pathshala. I am V.N. Prabhakar, visiting faculty at the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar. Under the paper Pre and Protohistoric Cultures of India, we will be looking into the module titled The Aryan Issue. At the end of this module, you will be able to understand the various complexities and the various approaches in the Aryan issue, and also to understand the different theories that has been propounded by various scholars working in this field for a quite long time. To begin with, we have to understand a little bit about the early history of how this identification between the language groups came into existence. One of the earliest proponent of this theory is Sir William Jones, who was the founder of the Asiatic Society in Calcutta. He identified the similarities between the languages, that is Sanskrit and the Indo-European languages. He propounded the theory that all belong to the same family, and this gave rise to the concept of Indo-European language family. He noticed the similarities between several words and how phonetically they sound to be similar. So this also led to the search of its common source. Like if all these languages are similar and they are interrelated, there should be some common source. So scholars and researchers, they went on searching for the common source. Later it is also called Proto-Indo-European, and the original homeland was the main search in this area. During the 19th century, numerous homelands were proposed, from India to Nordic region and from the Russian steppes to Germany. So there was no consensus. So one of the other proponents of the Aryan theory is Friedrich Max Müller. He is a Sanskritist and philologist. He produced the first complete edition of Rig Veda in the late 19th century. He regarded the Aryans as a conquering race, and the main confusion in his approach was that there was an identification between the language and race. They were mixed together, which Max Müller himself later rejected, but it is persisting for a very long time. The Britishers also used these theories and concepts to impose their rule, as they were a conquering force in India. They were a colonial force. They were to subjugate the Indian territory. So they were using this theory of an external force coming and ruling the native people. So this was a fascination among the Europeans also, and to establish their superiority. And later we can see in the early 20th century how the Nazis, they were also exploiting this theory and to show their superiority to subjugate many different type of people. We should also understand what is the Aryan theory. I mean, in a nutshell, we can look into some of the important factors. The main contention is that a new race or a new conquering people speaking an early form of Sanskrit, their language was Sanskrit, they entered India through the northwestern passes around 1500 BC, that is the earliest chronology given to this Aryan race, and subjugated the indigenous populations, making them adapt their language, its Vedic culture and caste-based social order. So it is also a general conception that the Aryans were generally fair, the indigenous people dark in complexion. The color of the skin may have been an important mark of their identity. This is really a misnomer which was later rejected by many people. Depicted in the Veda as dark-skinned, stub-nosed Dasyus or Dasas, the indigenous people have been variously identified with the ancestors of tribals, Shudras, Dalits, Dravidians, or later with the Harappans after the discovery of the Harappan civilization in 1924. In some versions of the theory, the invading Aryans, they destroyed their Indus-cities. In softer versions, they simply migrated into the subcontinent. More and more recent versions have abandoned the race concept because of the misconception in this very theory, and keeping only the arrival of the Indo-Aryan speakers. The Aryans, they settled in the Indus and Saraswati valleys, composed the Rig Veda around 1200 BC, that is the traditional chronology, and entered into the Ganges valley, whose thick forest cover they cleared with the aid of iron tools. These are all some of the issues in a nutshell, like how the Aryans are understood in India and how they entered into India and subjugated the local population, indigenous population, and imposed their culture. We can approach the Aryan issue through 7 approaches. There are 7 ways we can look into the Aryan issues. One of the approaches will be the literary. What do the texts actually say about the Aryans. The second approach may be geographical. What is the kind of geography described in the literature about the Aryans, where they were residing? The third approach will be archaeological. Can we find any archaeological evidences for the existence of the invasion or migration theories, whatever has been propounded? The fourth aspect will be cultural. Is there a cultural break that can be identified between the pre and the post-Aryan? The fifth one would be archaeological and genetic. Can an Aryan race as such can be identified, whether it can be defined or not? The sixth one will be astronomical. Is there any astronomical data to date the early Sanskritic text so that we can arrive at a chronology when the Aryans came into existence or when the Aryans moved into this area, and what is the date of their existence? The last and final one will be the linguistic approach. Does the linguistics demand or depend on the Aryan scenario? So we will be looking to these issues one by one. First we will take about the literary evidence. What is the literary evidence to say? Several Indian scholars and researchers, they have delved on this aspect. So one of the proponent is Swami Vivekananda. He identifies that the Sanskritic text does not mention about any original homeland as such. Like there should be an original homeland if the Aryans moved from particular area and occupied the Indian territory, Indian subcontinent. So as such, there is no mention of any original homeland of the Aryans. That is the identification, that is the thesis proposed by Swami Vivekananda. Another scholar, Sri Aurobindo, he opines that there is no actual mention of such an invasion as such in the Rig Veda, and there is no reliable indication of any racial difference between the Aryans and the Dasyus. So that is the kind of identification he makes, and he made it in 1914-16. He also rejected the European theories like the interpretation he rejected, and he also argued that the Veda could not be understood unless the symbolic language that is used in the Sanskritic text. So it has to be understood with a symbolism imbibed in the Sanskritic text. It is not taken as such on the face value. That is his kind of argument. One more important contribution is made by B.R. Ambedkar. He proposes various kind of identification. What is that? The Vedas do not know any such race as the Aryan race. So that is his first argument. The second argument is that there is no evidence in the Vedas of any invasion of India by the Aryan race. He also agrees to a certain extent with Sri Aurobindo, and he also says that there is no evidence to show the distinction between Aryans, Dasas and Dasyus, and there is no distinction in the racial scenario. The Vedas also not support the contention that the Aryas were different in color from the Dasas or Dasyus, because this is one of the major contention that the Aryans were fair and the Dasas or Dasyus were dark skinned. B.R. Ambedkar also concludes that if the Brahmins are Aryans, then the untouchable should also be Aryan. So he opines this in 1949. So these are some of the important contribution or observations by some scholars who have looked into this issue in a greater detail. So one more important component of the argument of the Aryan invasion is that the Aryans were fair-skinned and the local aboriginals or the local inhabitants, they are dark-skinned with stub-nosed aboriginals living in forts. So there are many verses in the Rig Veda which says like wrapped in darkness or a dark envelope are consistent with the conflict between the forces of light and forces of darkness. It is not actually mentioning about two different group of peoples. The inner meaning can be taken into account as Sri Aurobindo has opined. So we have to understand the inner meaning of these verses, like it could be a conflict between the dark forces and the quest for light. So it could be a victory of light over darkness. So all these kind of eulogies and various interpretations can be possible if you look into deeper and delve into deeper into the text of the Rig Veda. So one more identification or one more interpretation on this aspect is made by Maria Stechelich, who says that if Krishna Twak is translated with dark cloth or dark cover, but not with dark skin in that sense of dark complexion, it fits better into the habits of the Rigvedic poets' thinking. It is rather the trivial translation current till now. So the translation becomes an important aspect now. What the actual meaning imbibed in the Vedic text, it has to be understood. So the entire scenario is depending upon a very good understanding of the text. Such is the kind of interpretations and counter interpretations made by several scholars, and that's how we are delving more and more into these aspects with understanding from newer and newer research. So one more thing is that the Dasyus or the Dasas, they were living in the purs or the forts, and they have massive stone fortresses or cities and or small temporary circular structures made of palisades, mud and stones. But neither works, gods like Agni, Maruts and rivers like Saraswati, they are also invoked as purs. So there is no clear-cut identification also. And the Aryans also have purs. It is also in the Rigvedic literature that the Aryans, they were residing in purs, various kind of purs. Some purs are made of metal, some purs are made of stone, some are very long, having bastions. So these kind of identification are also there in the literature. In the summary, we can say that the Rigveda does not support forced colonial and racial kind of readings of dark-skinned, stub-nosed or aboriginals living in forts. It is a kind of a different environment in which we now understand that the Aryans, they were also living in various kind of purs, and not only the Dasyus or the Dasas. So what is the other literature, earliest literature of Indian subcontinent say about Aryan invasion? Because frequently the Dasyus or the Dasyas, they have been identified with the Dravidians of South India, and if we look into the earliest literature of South India, that is the Tamil Sangam literature, again the date of this literature is another controversy, and it is also agreed and disagreed upon the dates and chronology of the composition of the entire collection of Sangam literature. Some propose an early date of 200 or 300 BCE, and some propose a date of 100 CE after the current era. So there is again a disagreement in the dates, but it is a collection of a group of literature, and according to some of the scholars like T.R. Shesha Iyengar, there is no reference to either event, that is the Aryan invasion or migration. In the oldest extant Tamil classics, there is no tradition pointing to a home outside the Tamilakam, that is the Tamil land. So there are identification in the literature, like in the Sangam Tamil poems and texts, they often praise the Vedic and classical Hindu gods and goddesses. So the Vedas are the chanting of the Vedic hymns, Vedic sacrifices, fire rituals, etc. have been highly praised and highly referred to in the Tamil Sangam literature. For instance, the Purananuru, one of the oldest collections, it invokes gods like Shiva, Vishnu, Lakshmi. Lakshmi is mentioned as Thiru or Sri, and mentions Indra, Arundhati, the Pandavas, Kauravas, Ramas and Sita. So it is all a mention of all other gods and goddesses mentioned in the tradition Sanskritic literature. According to one of the foremost scholars of Tamil history, K.A. Nilakanda Sastri, he opines that there does not exist a single line of Tamil literature written before the Tamils came into contact with, and let us add accepted with genuine appreciation, the Indo-Aryan culture of North Indian origin. So this would hardly be the case if the two cultures had clashed. We move into the next aspect, that is the geographical aspect, what kind of information we gather from the geography mentioned in the early Sanskrit literature. The Rig Veda, it mentions various oceans like samudras, ships sailing, storms, waves, treasures of the ocean, pearls, shell, etc. All of these are of marine origin, nothing is of river origin. So Bujyu is repeatedly mentioned as having been saved by Ashwins from the storm at sea. Such an intimacy with the sea seems incompatible with recent immigrants from Central Asia who had come and settled in the northern plains of the Indian subcontinent. The Rig Veda's geography is Sapta Sendua, the land watered by the 7 rivers, including the 5 tributaries of Indus and the river Saraswati. It also mentions about Irina or Irina, identified by several scholars like R.N. Iyengar and R.S. Bisht to run of Kutch, that is located in the northern portion of Gujarat. These areas which are very far away from the northern plains would not have been known if the recent migration happened from outside and they settled in the northern plains. So this is the geography mentioned in the Rig Veda. If you look into the map, this is the area watered by the 7 rivers and mentioned this Rig Vedic literature, and the area resided by the Rig Vedic Aryans. Coming to the third aspect, that is archaeology. What is archaeology has to say? I mean, in the same area mentioned in the Rig Vedic literature, that the geography mentioned the Rig Vedic literature, we find a flourishing civilization during the 3rd millennium BC, during which the Saraswati river was flowing from the mountains to the sea, and it was in existence. And we can see the number of Harappan sites plotted all along the river Saraswati during the mature Harappan phase, that is from 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. After around 1900 BCE, the civilization start to kind of decline. There are various reasons attributed to the decline of this Harappan civilization, and one of the reasons attributed is the drying up of river Saraswati, which happened around 1900 BCE, and we have very good radiochronological dates which happen from Harappa and other Harappan sites, which clearly indicate that after 1900 BCE, the civilization slowly declined and converted into many regional cultures and became a localized culture. One of the excavators of Harappa, former Director Generals of Archaeological Survey of India, is Sir Mortimer Wheeler. He propounded, based on some of the skeletal evidence from Mohenjo-daro, the lying up of skeletons in a scattered fashion, not in a any typical burial condition, as evidences of Aryan invasion. The incoming Aryan hordes, they destroyed the local population and there was a massacre. He spoke highly in a dramatical fashion of the final massacre at Mohenjo-daro, basing himself on 33 skeletons found in a few streets, and his famous quote, "Indra stands accused," was termed as the evidence for the Aryan invasion in Indian subcontinent. But the identification of this massacre, so-called massacre by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, has been discounted or rejected by several other archaeologists. Like one of the foremost evidence is propounded by American archaeologist George F. Dales in 1964, who did a reanalysis of the skeletons from Mohenjo-daro, and he observes that it was a mythical massacre and the skeletons did not probably belong to the same epoch as of the Indus civilization. And several other scholars also have questioned about the evidence propounded by Sir Mortimer Wheeler. In the 1980s, bioanthropologists like Kenneth R. Kennedy, he found that most of the so-called injuries on the skeletons, they were all as a result of post-mortem erosion, that is after the burial, and or had actually healed well before the death. So these are clear indication that they were not massacred by the incoming Aryans, and now this theory can be very easily abandoned. We can go on listing many other scholars who have rejected these Aryan invasions based on archaeological evidences, like Jim Schaffer, Yarij, B.B. Lal, Mark Kenoyer, Dilip Chakravarti, and they have clearly shows that the time gap that is between the 1900 BC and the 1500 BC, which is the supposed arrival of the Aryans, shows that in any case that the latter could not have been the cause of the Harappan decline, because we don't have any clear archaeological evidence of incoming of such a large invasion. After the demise of the Harappan civilization or the Indus Valley civilization, it kind of dissipated or localized into several regional cultures. Some of the regional cultures are Symmetry H, Jukar and Jankar in the Sindh, and Late Kuli in the southern Balochistan, and Rangpur in the Gujarat area. So it saw many regional cultures of a rural natures, and that have been tentatively associated with the incoming Aryans. We will see how this could also be discounted. The Symmetry H culture has been identified by several scholars as the Aryan invasion evidence. Like earlier, the scholars like Gordon Child, he opines that the Symmetry H intruders may belong to the Aryan invaders. D.D. Kosambi, he identifies the Symmetry culture is undoubtedly Aryan. Even scholars like B.R. Alchin, he felt and he is tempted to associate the Symmetry H pottery with the arrival of Indo-Aryans. So whether it's a really an Aryan culture, we can look into evidences which they are supporting or they are going against these kind of interpretations. There are several instances, several evidences coming from the symmetry etch pottery designs like the bulls, gazelles, peacocks and people leaves, stars and fishes. They are all actually coming from the in continuity of the previous mature Harappan phase, and they are not clear innovations of the symmetry etch people. The painted decoration shows an overwhelming craft continuity with that of the preceding period. That's how Bridget and Raymond Alchin they concludes in 1982. The symmetry hedge culture may reflect only a change in the focus of settlement organization. It is not an urban culture anymore. It has become a rural culture, and the urban decay, invading aliens or site abandonment, all of which have been suggested in the past can be kind of discounted. That's how the observation of Mark Kenoyer. Also, Rafiq Mughal, one of the archaeologists of Pakistan archaeology, he observed that the Punjab late Harappan symmetry etch culture shows continuity from the mature Harappan, that is the previous period. Thus, if the symmetry etch culture is Aryan, so is the preceding culture also, that is the mature phase could also be Aryan. So, this is the kind of theories put forth by some of the scholars. Similarly, several other rural cultures like the Jukar culture in the Sindh or some other rural cultures posterior to the Harappan civilization have been identified with the Aryan invasion or the Aryan culture. So, but it has become an arbitrary kind of argument, like many people just looking into the rural nature of the culture and posterior to the Harappan civilization tend to identify these cultures as the evidence of Aryans. So, one of the French archaeologist Cazal, he opines that until now Aryans have eluded all archaeological definition. So far, no type of artifact, no class of pottery has been discovered that will enable us to say that the Aryans came this way. Here is typically a Aryan sword or goblet. So this is the kind of material culture that has to be come out from the archaeological record if there was a clearly any Aryan kind of thing that could be reflected in the material culture in the past archaeological record. Some of the scholars, they also tend to identify some cultures located in the Indian subcontinent and also outside the subcontinent with the Indo-European homeland, but with no consensus. Some of the cultures identified are the BMAC, that is the Bactrium-Margiana archaeological complex, that is an urban culture dated between 2100 to 1500 BC, that is located in the Central Asian region, that is also identified with the Indo-European migrations. One of the foremost and contentious issues in the Aryan problem is the horse, whether the Aryans mention about the horse, then where is the horse in the archaeological record. These kind of arguments have been put forth, and that's why the Harappan civilization is not generally identified with the Aryan culture, because there is no evidence of horse in the Harappan civilization, and the horse has been highly eulogized, and it is a general conception that the Aryans came into hordes and hordes of chariots driven by them and invaded the local population. There are several evidences put forth by scholars. Some scholars identify horse bones from Surkotada and other Harappan sites, but some scholars, they completely discard these findings. And it is not a general consensus now that horses can be very effectively identified in the Harappan civilization, but there are some identifications which have been made by the some of the archaeologists and archaeozoologists. One of the identification is made by the late Hungarian archaeozoologist, who is an authority of prehistory of the horse. He identifies some horse remains in the Harappan civilization. Mortimer Wheeler, he observes that the bones of a horse occur at high level at Mohenjo-daro, and from the earliest, doubtless pre-Harappan, later at Rana Gundai in northern Balochistan, both horse and ass are recorded. It is likely enough that camel, horse and ass were in fact all of a familiar feature of the Indus caravans. So horse is of course a very important contentious issues, whether other arguments put forth by several scholars, Sanskrit scholars, how the term horse can be eulogized in terms of swiftness. It kind of speed movement by the people, and it cannot be directly associated with some one kind of animal. So there are various theories and perceptions without a general consensus emerge among the scholars dealing with the Aryans and the horses. The fourth aspect will be the cultural break or continuum, whether there is a cultural break or continuum which can be observed in the pre and post Vedic context. But if we look into the Harappan legacy, what the Harappan legacy says with the demise of the Harappan civilization and the emergence of the Gangetic civilization, it has been generally conceived that there is a dark period, that is a complete absence of any cultures, and this was the period during which the Aryans came and they settled and they were responsible for the establishment of the second urbanization, and all these theories were put forth. But looking into some of the evidences, if we look into the kind of general architecture existing in the Harappan cities, the kind of central courtyard surrounded by rooms, it is a general phenomena. Even if we look into a modern house in a village in remote Rajasthan or Haryana, generally the architecture is of a central courtyard surrounded by rooms which have been identified for some specific purpose. Some may be for storage, some may be for some craft activities. So there is a general kind of continuity in terms of even building houses. The ratios and proportions, they are an important component in the Harappan built architecture. If we analyze various sites like Mohenjo-daro or Dholavira, we see a specific ratios and proportions in the arrangement of buildings, whether it may be the Great Bath or the Pillared Hall or important buildings like college or granary. Some specific ratios and proportions have been followed by the Harappans. This is the same case in Dholavira. And the overall arrangement of the city planning, we see some specific ratios and proportions which are clearly followed in the construction. And if we trace most of the Harappan structures, they follow some simple ratios, which is a deliberate choice and not a random distribution. If we look into the various aspects of the ratios and proportions across many sites like Kalibanga, Surkotada, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa and Dholavira, we see some specific ratios and proportions followed in widely separated regions, whether in Punjab or Gujarat or Sindh. And so it is a deliberate choice of building structures with some specific ratios and proportions and not a random distribution. One more continuity in terms of Harappans and the later period is the metrology. What is the kind of linear measurements the Harappans were using in those systems? Analysis by various scholars like V. Mainkar, Mohan Pant, Shuji Funo, or Professor Balasubramaniam and Michel Danino, it clearly indicates that a basic angula of 1.76 centimeter or 1.77 or 78 centimeter could be the basic unit of measurement for the Harappan units. From where they get this evidence, they look into the evidences of some linear scale obtained from sites like Lothal and other archaeological sites and tend to extrapolate it with other buildings, larger buildings, and whether it fits in the basic linear measurement. So there is a kind of a clear-cut indication of usage of a basic measurement system which the Harappans followed. Similarly, we also have the highly standardized weighing system during the Harappans, which is a binary system with the base average weight of 13.64 grams and progressing in a binary progression, that is 1:2:4:8 like that, and also a second sequence with the multiples of previous series, 160, 200, 320 like that, and going up to 12,800 grams. This is a highly standardized weighing system that was in use in the Harappan civilization, and some scholars have identified that there is a continuity during the later period also. Like a scholar John Mitchiner, he compared the Harappan and traditional Indian weights and found that more or less they are very much similar with the traditional Indian weighing system. He also opines that every likelihood of the earlier Takshila hoard being weighed on the same kind of balances and by much the same sort of weights as at Mohenjo-daro some 2000 years earlier. So the evidence from Harappan weights, from Takshila hoard and the traditional Indian weighing system more or less tallies. So we can tend to identify the beginnings of this weighing system to the Harappans, and it is a long continuity which is being followed during the subsequent periods and also in our traditional weighing system. Similarly, we can see evidences of several other aspects in the Indus civilization that has a continuity during later period, like at Lothal there are evidences of gamesmen which are very closely associated with the modern chess game. I mean, that could be an ancestor, even ancestor to the modern chess game. The gamesmen are so similar to the gamesmen of the later period, and also the dices and even the cubical dice and the rectangular dice, they are all very similar to even which are used during the modern times. So there is definitely a clear-cut continuity if we look into even very small aspects like gaming and other pastime activities of the Harappans. Similarly, even today we use the conch trumpets for some rituals, performance of rituals, even for ablutions. So this is also a long continuity originated from the Harappan period, and we still using this kind of ritualistic tools for performing various kind of rituals and worship purposes. One more evidence put forth by scholars is the kind of continuity in the agricultural practice. One of the earliest agricultural ploughed field was discovered at Kalibanga of the early Harappan period, that is preceding 2600 BCE. This ploughed field, it clearly shows a double cropping pattern. Interestingly, in an agriculture field near the Kalibangan site, in the Kalibangan village, the same pattern was still followed by the local villagers. Two crops, so that simultaneously it can be grown in two different directions. The crops can be simultaneously grown. So this is also a good evidence of a continuation what we have adopted from the Harappan period, or there is a very long continuation of these traditions which percolated even into the present period. One more aspect which we see a continuity in terms of depiction of certain motifs is endless knot design. The endless knot design, which is one of the popular motifs during the Harappan civilization, seen on even seals. So it is even continued up to the historical period. One of the Gujarat Rashtrakuta dynasty inscription of Dhruva II, it has this endless knot design depicted in the inscription and the copper plate inscription. And also we have this endless knot design depicted on the Fatehpur Sikri masonry marks. So clearly there is a continuity of certain symbols, certain motifs from the Harappan period up to the later historical period. If we review all this continuity in the Harappan legacy, whether there is a continuity from Harappan period to the later period, so there is definitely a transmission of concepts and practices of urbanism, technologies and crafts, and there are survival of symbols and iconographic motifs, ornaments, and also many aspects common to popular Hinduism. Tree worship, including the people tree, mother goddess worship and animal sacrifice, they have a continuity, and also a probable presence of fire worship, particularly in the Gujarat and Saraswati region. And also there is a possibility of a linga worship, because we know from the Harappan context the phallic worship and long, tall, freestanding columns from Dholavira, and linga like features from Harappa and other sites. So there is also a hint or an indication to the tradition of yoga and meditation. So all these things are aspects which originated or which are found earlier in the Harappan civilization and continue even into the modern period. So the fifth aspect which we deal about is the bioanthropology and genetics. What is the bioanthropology can tell about the detailed things about the evidences which we get from the archaeological evidences, and also looking into the kind of population graphics. Some of the recent researches made by scholars like Pratap C. Datta, Kenneth A.R. Kennedy, and Brian Hemphill and John Lucas, they see that only two discontinuities in the population of the Indus Valley. Like Brian Hemphill, he concludes only two discontinuities in western and northern fringes of the Indus Valley. The first discontinuity occurs between 6000 and 4500 BC, with another discontinuity at some points after 800 BC but before 200 BC. So there is a biological continuity from 4500 BC to 800 BC, and there is no evidence in terms of bioarchaeological evidences for mass migration around 1500 BC. That is the general date in which Aryans are supposed to have entered in the Indian subcontinent. One more aspect of dealing with this problem is the DNA analysis. How there is a possibility of having a large number of DNA samples and tracing the paleo DNA analysis. One of the most important concept is the Y DNA, which is transmitted from father to son, and the mitochondrial DNA, which is transmitted by the mother alone. So DNA molecules, they undergo random mutations which are transmitted to descendants, and genetics cannot define races, only haplogroups and the people having common set of genetic mutations, and this can be used to measure the genetic proximity or a distance between ethnic groups. So a study in 2003, it shows the complexity of the Indian populations. One of these is nearest to the Central Asia, from the Aryans are supposed to have come, is the Chenchus, Dravidian speaking tribals from Andhra Pradesh, and Punjabis and Konkani Brahmins should have been close to Central Asia, but they are actually distant. So this is how the DNA analysis indicate. So looking into this diagram, we can clearly see the central point is the Central Asia, and all other Indian population, they are not very close to the Central Asian population, Central Asian DNA which is available. You can see the Chenchus are close, but the Gujaratis, Bengalis, Brahmins, the Brahmins, they are far away from this point of convergence. So this is also another indication that the Indian population, they are a clear different group defined by the mitochondrial DNA composition, and they have only distant relation. They don't have a very close proximity with the Central Asian population. The next aspect which we can look into in terms of identification of Aryans or the early Vedic people is the archaeoastronomical aspect. This can help in fixing certain chronology, looking into the constellations and the astronomical events described in the Rigvedic literature, and looking into the astronomical constellations mentioned in the Rigvedic literature. One of the scholar, Jacobi, he pointed that the pole star referred to in the Grihya Sutras cannot be today's pole star. The text date to about 500 BCE, and because of the precision, there was no pole star then. They must have preserved a memory of the previous pole star, that is Alpha Draconis, pointing to about 2800 BCE. So what is this movement? What is this precision? Because every 72 years there is a movement by about 1 degree, and in every 25,800 years it happens for a full rotation. The celestial longitudes of constellations which was observed in 3000 years ago cannot be the same as in today. So it is also a continuous movement of the stars, constellation and the planets. So whatever observed in terms of 3000 years ago, 6000 years ago cannot be the same today. So that is how the pole star, which is the Alpha Draconis, observed around 2800 BC, it is not the pole star today. So these kind of things also help in kind of giving certain chronology to the astronomical events observed during the early period and recorded in the early literature. There are also evidences from other literatures like the Yajurveda. It lists around 27 nakshatras or lunar mansions mapping the moon's path seen from the earth. So these observations also points to around 2400 to 2900 BCE. So again, the kind of astronomical observations made and recorded in the early literature, which can be used to fix some dating purposes. For example, one of the oldest texts of astronomy, the Vedanga Jyotisha, it deals mostly with the time division and the calendar marking. It records the location of the summer and winter solstices in the middle of nakshatra Ashlesha in Hydra and the beginning of Dhanishta or Delphinus. So this points to about a date of 1400 BCE. So these are all very good evidences, and that can be helpful in kind of fixing certain chronological time frames, and there are many such references proposed in the early literature, all of them pointing to a high antiquity incompatible with the composition of Rig Veda around 1200 BCE. So if the Rig Veda was composed around 1200 BCE or 1500 BCE, all these astronomical constellations or observations that cannot be fit into, because they actually belong to a much older period. The counter argument has been either to dismiss these references as meaningless, yet they are precise and present a consistent picture, or to suggest that the Vedic texts somehow preserve the memory of much ancient astronomical events. It is there in their memory from a very ancient period, but why then and could they also record the contemporary events? So if a counter argument is there that through the memory they had preserved all these astronomical calculations and they passed it on up to 1200 BCE, why they have not made any contemporary observations that were happening during the 1200 to 800 BCE? This is a very important question that has to be taken into account. The final aspect on the Aryan issue is the linguistic aspect, how the linguistics can be used in interpreting the Aryan issue. So the map shows the India's linguistic families, that is dominated by the Indo-European languages and the Dravidian group. The former's origin and evolution were extensively studied by the linguists in the 19th century, leading to the reconstruction of the Proto-Indo-European language, that is PIE. There are two important groups of the Indo-European language family. One is the Western group, that is composed containing most of the European and other language groups. Next is the Eastern group of the Indo-European family, which more or less contains all the Indian languages and the Iranian languages. One of the important arguments is of the original homeland from where these languages originate, but there are many homelands identified by these scholars. It is not a single homeland ranging from northern Europe to central Europe, the Uralic Olgan steppes, various parts of Anatolia, Bactria. So such wide divergence it is happening, and it is not inspiring confidence. One of the Indologists, Edwin Byrant, he observes the minute one tries to further narrow this vast Indo-European speaking area, one enters the quagmire of speculation and disagreement that has been characteristic of the Indo-European homeland quest since its inception. So there is not a single agreement of the homeland or from where it is originating. So it is a kind of multiple theories, multiple identifications proposed without any consensus. Some of the scholars, they also agree propose a pre-Sanskritic substratum, whether it can be observed in the literature. So they argue the presence of Dravidian words in the Rig Veda, and which proves the existence of a Dravidian substratum. However, there is no agreement on such a vocabulary. Scholars have proposed that there are 500 words, 300 words, 380 words, there is only one word. One scholar says there is only 0 words. So one scholar says there are 100 Paramunda words. So again, there is no general agreement whether there is really a Dravidian substratum or a pre-Sanskritic substratum. So therefore, what we can conclude is that no language lives in isolation. Always the people, they come into close contact with other population, and the presence of non-Sanskritic words in the Rig Veda may just as well indicate long-standing exchange and borrowing, and not necessarily posteriority. So this kind of borrowings could have been happening all the time, and it is not that any language or any set of population, they were living in isolation, and they were all constantly borrowing and exchanging ideas and words. Another example of proposing a Dravidian theory or identification of Dravidian words or group of population is the case of Brahui. Brahui, a Dravidian language which is spoken in parts of Balochistan, is taken as Harappan relic. So people tend to identify them as the original Harappans, which they have been pushed away by the invading Aryans, and now a certain isolated group in Balochistan, they are the descendants of the Harappans, and the Harappan language was Dravidian. That's how it has been identified by some of the scholars. However, Brahui, it is shown to be a recent import into the region going back to only 1000 years, identified by several scholars like Bloch, Imanok, Hawk and Elfenbein. So its presence has nothing to do with an assumed linguistic relic from the Harappan times. The linguistic pockets, they also prove nothing without a historical perspective. And one such argument put forth is that the presence of an Anglo-Indian community in the Nilgiris of Tamil Nadu does not indicate that Tamil Nadu's earliest language was English. So we have to identify what is the exact period in which these kind of language groups emerge, and after that we have to make arguments of to which culture or which civilization they belong to. So looking into several arguments, if we want to sum up what is happening, some of the Indian scholars they argue, like R.S. Sharma, they argue the Indo-Europe Aryan migrants seem to have been numerous and strong enough to continue and disseminate much of their culture. He proposed in 2001 they have been a much larger and numerous group. Another Indian historian, Romila Thapar, she argues that I would like to suggest that it was not in fact a massive migration. So from invasion to migration to trickle in theory. And the US Sanskritist Michael Witzel, he argues just one Afghan Indo-Aryan tribe that did not return to the highlands but stayed in their Punjab winter quarters in spring was needed to set off a wave of acculturation in the plains by transmitting its status kits to its neighbors. R.S. Sharma's large-scale invasion is mostly undetected in archaeology, bioanthropology and genetics. But how a small-scale or trickle-in migration are sufficed to alter the subcontinent's culture and linguistic landscape so radically, that has to be understood in a better manner if such theories are proposed, that a small trickle or a small scale movement of people can substantially alter the linguistic landscape. It has to be identified further and further. So the counter argument is that if some small scale trickling can change the entire linguistic landscape, why the substantial invasions of the Persians, Greeks, Scythians, Kushanas, Hunas could not effect such a change. So to sum up, the Aryan invasion or the migration theory, which is in existence for a pretty long period, it has no support in terms of literary, archaeological, anthropological or genetic evidence. The so-called Aryans, it's still elusive, we have to find them on the ground. the same problem confronts supposed migrations of the Indo-European speakers in Iran or Europe. Even in minor aspects such as Aryans bringing iron, already present in the Ganges plain by 1800 BCE, or clearing the Gangetic forest, which were only pockets, the Aryan scenario has failed because we have iron coming from the northern plains from much earlier dates. The persistent conflation between race, language and culture is also misleading in certain many ways. The only legitimate use of the term Aryan today is linguistic, and it is not racial, and a better term should be Indo-Aryan speakers or cultural. A better term is Vedic. So in linguistic, a better term could be Indo-Aryan speakers, and in culturally it could be the Vedic. So we have to discard many terminologies that have been in existence for a pretty long period. A final answer may come with an accumulation of archaeological and genetic evidence, or with the decipherment of the Indus script. That could be a key, because that is one of the oldest scripts in the world and the earliest in the Indian subcontinent, dating back to 3rd millennium BCE. The decipherment of this script may throw much valuable light on the kind of society that was in existence during that period. Thus we have looked into various aspects related to the Aryan problem. It is again not without any clear-cut conclusion, because there are several aspects which have to be looked into, researched upon several times, and looking into arguments and counter arguments, and finding proper evidence from many different aspects like archaeological, genetical and more scientific tools which are available today, which can be helpful in a very good understanding of the Aryan issues. And any conclusion may not hold good unless and until it is accepted by a big scholarly world. For more information on this issue, you can look into the other quadrants of this module, which can be viewed in the EPG Pathshala website, and also you can view into other modules related to this module for more information.